on this stage the Accelerating Intra-African Trade with Fintech under the AfCFTA. If you're interested in what's next for Fintech in Africa, please make your way to the breakout room. So to facilitate this conversation, I'm delighted to introduce Joy Basu, who serves as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of African Affairs, overseeing economics and regional affairs. And before joining the Biden administration, Ms. Basu was actually championed opportunities to facilitate entrepreneurship and build a groundbreaking multi-billion-dollar impact investment platform. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you to my fellow panelists. Very much looking forward to this conversation. What I'll first do is I'll have my panelists introduce themselves, kind of what brings them to this conversation, and then we'll get right into it with some really meaty topics. So without further ado, Whitney, may I ask you to start?
Thank you, Joy. Good afternoon. My name is Whitney Schneidman, and I'm a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, and for the last 10 years chaired the Africa practice at Covington and Burling, here, which is headquartered here in Washington. We have an office in Johannesburg that's Africa-facing.
Yeah, I'm Adeshina. I'm actually the CEO and founder at TradeLender, and we're building a digital bank supporting MSMEs to get access to credit. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. I'm Archit Bagaria. I'm the head of investments at Omnibus Africa. We are a B2B e-commerce company trying to enable traditional retail in Africa.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes. My name is Zakaria Samsadu, the co-founder of Africa Fintech Summit, and I also lead an East Africa-based go-to-market advisory service, IBEX Frontier. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you all. I think what is so exciting about this topic is the diversity of stakeholders who have such a strong part of accelerating fintech on the continent. I think for me, you know, whenever I'm on the continent, both having lived there and worked there, is this idea that you see, you know, I think integration and fintech are where you see such highlighting the capability and the potential and the creativity of the continent. And, you know, when you fly somewhere, you look and you see, you know, I think the story of Africa is often about the lack of energy and, you know, when you're flying and you see the lack of lights. But I think what's really exciting is when you're flying and you see those lights, they're moving across borders, right? We know that there's these rich people-to-people connections both across the continent, and it's a matter of how you make that informal economy more formal and how you capture that so that, you know, African goods and people and ideas can trade not only for the benefit of the African people, but for the world. And so, you know, without further ado, let's kind of jump into those topics. I'd love to ask everyone, you know, this panel is really framed around the AfCFTA. As many of us know in this room, today intra-African trade stands at just about 14% of total African exports. But there's some UNCTAD forecasting showing that AfCFTA could boost intra-Africa trade by at least a third, while cutting the continent's trade deficit by half. Obviously, that's the excitement potential that gets us all here, and we know that that, you know, won't happen overnight. So I'd love to hear from each of you what you see as the opportunity and what excites you with AfCFTA, but also the priority bottlenecks that you're experiencing, either directly in your enterprises or the organizations that you work with. Whitney, can I start with you?
Sure. Thank you, Joy. Well, there's no question that we're at an inflection point now. I mean, I think the fact that the AfCFTA is gaining such momentum is so critical. And I think one of the data points that I come back to, a recent study by Accenture found that there are more software developers in Africa, 720,000, than there are in the state of California, 630,000. What does that say? You know, software developers in California, you know, Steve Jobs started Apple nearly 50 years ago, so there's been a long time for software developers. But in Africa, not so much. And the growth is so quick and so fast. And I think that really augurs well for driving data and digital trade going forward. But a lot has to happen. You know, on the one hand, we were talking earlier about the digital protocol of the AfCFTA. to be honest, we haven't seen a lot of definition. Yet every country has its own data policy. So how do we harmonize that to make sure that goods and data flows across borders, securely, fairly, and people are protected? These are big challenges, and I think these are some of the issues that I'm focused on right now.
Thank you, Whitney. Adishna, I'd love to hear, with TradeLenda, how are you seeing the opportunities of AfCFTA, but also what are the roadblocks for your company?
Yeah, so the opportunities, for me, I will take it from two drivers, which is actually helping them to be able to access the market and also the financial services to be able to give them the capacity to be able to do more. There's no point of us trying to drive an Africa free trade when we haven't even covered, the capacity in terms of what the regional or perhaps even the in-country actually needs. And I think supporting these MSMEs, supporting these farmers, who are actually, the backbone of this economy and the drivers that will facilitate the Africa free trade would actually be the way to go. And I think there's very little concentration as regards to, helping them to be able to, finally reach this grassroots. For me, for example, we have the farmers who are struggling in terms of storage, which I'll touch on various other areas and questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Archit?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think to enable free trade across Africa, we need to enable the youth and the entrepreneurial spirit that is in Africa. And I think when you said about lack of energy, I think about the other side of the energy, which is the human energy. And I think the two big bottlenecks in my mind that the AfCFTA can help with is currency access and access to more human capital, where there is a lot of intelligence and knowledge to be exchanged and brought in from different countries across Africa, which can be enabled through this. Plus, through the PAPSS, there can be access to currency plus transactions being more easier, which will enable B2B e-commerce and commerce in general across the continent.
I couldn't agree more. And so often we think about trade in Africa and commerce as a matter of resources, and obviously the greatest natural resource are the people, the entrepreneurs, the business people, everything, and that sort of has to be the first place we tap. Zacharias, I will actually add a second question for you because I know you're such an expert when it comes to these policy trade barriers, and so I'd love to ask you generally about the question, but specifically, can you talk to us a little bit about the importance of cross-border payment interoperability and the settlement guarantee process to smooth cross-border trade specifically? I think that's something that's really technical and tactical that your expertise would be very valued on.
Thank you very much, Joy. So when we talk about the cross-border payment, just imagine two small traders living in two different countries, and they were just serving their city, their town, their country, and all of a sudden there's an opportunity. They knew the opportunity that they can trade across the border, but the regulation, the tariff, the customs, it was so cumbersome, so painful that they don't even consider it. Now we're telling them that's gone. Now you don't have to limit yourself to a production limit of XYZ because of the market you're serving. Actually, you have a 200 million population that you can serve next door. So they can increase their production. The export is now possible. But the next question is, I am exporting from Ghana to Nigeria, a small business to another small business. So he's asking two questions. One, how do I even know the central bank in Nigeria will guarantee my payment in my local currency when we're talking about dollar illiquidity that we're hearing across Africa? And secondly, how do I know my importer that A, the government, the central bank will enforce payment, or maybe the counterparty, my central bank, my government will ensure that I receive the payment. So you're touching both macro and micro level. So the payment interoperability is one, assuring settlement. Yes, you're moving goods from one country to another, but you need to have that absolute assurance to the traders that no matter what happens, your funds are settled. Don't worry about the dollar or whatever currency shortage the markets are in, you will get your goods. And that is what now the PAPSS, Pan-African Payment and Settlement system is putting in place. Central banks are settling transactions between their countries, between their central banks, without the need for illiquidity that they are operating in. That is one. Secondly, the central banks will also ensure that the seller, the exporter, as long as he is or she is exporting under the free continental free trade, their payment is as good as guaranteed. I think that is very important if we're going to have a real outcome from this intercontinental free trade.
Indeed, and I think this is a place where obviously the US government generally and the State Department in particular, these are issues that are very important that we are trying to be a good partner on. You know, we've watched the launch of the digital transformation with Africa. Today we saw the Tech for Trade Alliance that was launched. I'd love to hear your perspectives on these US government initiatives to foster digital trade. What excites you about them, kind of what else you would like to see, and maybe I'll kind of have us come back the other way. Arjit, do you mind starting with this question?
No, definitely. Thank you for that question. I think it's so fitting because we, 10 days ago, for our ongoing fundraise, became a part of Prosper Africa's initiative. I think them helping us with the raise, plus also supporting in the capital markets is very timely for how the environment is right now. I also think that it will help, the Tech for Trade Alliance particularly will help with a lot of knowledge sharing. Decentralized finance plus technology understanding in the United States has been capitalized very well over the years, and those learnings can then be shared with the African continent, and there can be back and forth where we in Africa know how to do a lot of these, know how to solve a lot of these problems at a very cost-effective way. And I think that's where Prosper Africa plus the Tech for Trade Alliance would be very, very key.
Thank you. Adeshina, what are your thoughts on kind of the way the US government is leaning into digital trade in Africa? What excites you? What else can we be doing?
Yeah, so I'm quite excited about some of the work that has been ongoing so far, and specifically this has to do about helping the grassroots. There's a lot of initiatives currently going on all across Africa, Nigeria to be precise, by various agencies of the government. And what it does is it removes the collateral need for some of these specific players. So for example, with farmers getting inputs, typically the traditional banks will not give them credit without them getting collateral. But today, with some of these initiatives, there's a form of bank guarantee that is being provided, working with the venture firms, working with some of the banks, which then allows the micro lenders, allows some of the banks to be able to offer credit for input for the farmers, because they are the ones actually building and producing some of this produce that we use to be able to facilitate some of these trades, and also even the retailers, the SMEs, who are trying to build businesses. Having some form of guarantees helps to democratize access to credit, because you are sure that you can empower more women, you can empower more people to be able to go into the business that they know how to go about, but they don't have the needed capital to be able to move from A to B. So I think it's quite interesting to see it unfold, and it's quite already revealing in terms of the impact that it's having on the continent. Thank you.
Of course, thank you, and it just really highlights that fintech is an opportunity for such strong efforts for private sector to contribute to economic development, and a means of being inclusive in that. Whitney, I'd love to ask you kind of generally about these initiatives, what excites you, but also ask you, you're somebody who has been working on US government kind of trade initiatives with Africa for a few years now, and I know you were there from the beginning of AGOA, and you understand kind of where the US government has strengths to be supportive, and I'd love to ask you, what would you see as our priorities, both with AfCFTA, but also AGOA and more broadly?
Great. Thanks. This is a really interesting conversation. Just to go back to this subject about what the USG can bring.
Yes.
You know? And certainly the technical assistance, certainly the financing, but I think what it can also bring is the convening power. And what I've seen it do is like work with our hyperscaler tech companies, you know, like the Microsofts and the Googles and the Metas, to really leverage their capabilities on behalf of SMEs. And we're seeing that a lot. And I thought we saw that during the Africa Leaders Summit, where a number of commitments were made in the tech sector. So I think that's really important to keep an eye on.
I agree.
And then, you know, from AGOA, you know, which has sort of been our flagship commercial policy, right? Digital hasn't really played much over the last 20, 25 years, but clearly it has to play a very important role going forward. And I don't think we've really figured out what that is going to be. But one takeaway that I have from AGOA that I think is relevant, when AGOA was renewed in 2015 for 10 years, the US Congress asked all AGOA beneficiaries to develop national utilization strategies. And maybe half of the AGOA countries have actually done it. Those that have done it have seen their AGOA exports increase 100, 300, as much as 3,000%. So what does that tell us? It tells us that when governments really drill down on sectors, on issues, removing bottlenecks, it can work. And I think that can work in the digital space as much as it can for creating exports, either to the United States or through the AfCFTA into Africa.
Indeed. And Whitney, I'm looking forward to all your thought leadership as we think about renewing in 2025. Zacharias, I'd love to come to you building off of Whitney's question, or Whitney's comment right now. What are the policies that you've seen various African governments take that have been really enabling of this space? Are there success stories and positive examples that you would call out for other African governments to see as examples?
Yes, I think in addition to countries, we can see already existing trade blocks, so to speak. For example, the COMESA Eastern Africa region is, I think, one of the most integrated economically. There is a free trade movement, including people's movement in that region. So I think for the continental free trade to be successful, existing regional blocks can grow, mature, and integrate. So we have success stories. But circling back to what Whitney was saying, the AGOA experience can be extrapolated to this. For example, when countries were asked to have a national utilization policy, they're really looking inwards and see where is our strengths. So some countries actually analyze their strengths, and they saw that maybe they will be competitive in textile, and they became the best textile exporters. Others thought that they will be best in agriculture. So knowing your strengths and weaknesses will be good. So just like countries have done to AGOA, know their strengths, they know their competitive advantage, and took advantage of it. They invested well in the infrastructure, and they adjusted their policies, they harmonized their policy, and then, as Whitney said, that we have countries that increased their export by 800%. Because they knew their competitive advantage, they took advantage of it. Just like that, when we're talking about the free intercontinental free trade, so you have West Africa versus East Africa. So, for example, in a country in East Africa, to take advantage of it, they need to know their cost structure, their advantage, their human capital. So what is their best exportable product? Or what is the shortage next door? Who is importing X amount of product from abroad? How can I take advantage of that? How can we change our policy? How can we encourage actually maybe the youth, the unemployed actually to take advantage of it? How can we create employable jobs and then can take advantage? So take your competitive advantage, change your policy, remove what can be a barrier, and take the lesson that from countries that actually took the advantage of the AGOA and changed their progress. I think that is a good starting point.
I agree, and here I'll be a little bit critical. I think as we think about AGOA renewing, hopefully next year, I think one place where it hasn't been as effective is with small and medium enterprises, with SMEs, and that's something that we really need to think about because SMEs, really power the economy all over the world, but particularly in Africa. And so, Arch, I'd love to ask you if you could really talk us through, how e-commerce and fintech really capitalize on the power of SMEs in Africa, and a little bit about what you're seeing with your clients and what excites you about, the power for trade that's fintech led.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And before answering the question, I would like to take a step back and explain a bit more around the solution.
Please do.
We started in 2019 with the goal to digitize the entire trade ecosystem. We started with distributors, digitize their relationship with manufacturers. Post that, we onboarded logistics providers on our platform. And last but not the least, the star of our show, the retailers, the small and medium enterprises. Now, all of these are SMEs, and we integrated all of them into one platform, which is OmniBiz. And our objective was to enable them with the right tools and partner with multiple financial service providers plus different technology partners to be able to provide them the tools they need to grow. Now, it took 3 years for us with vigorous effort to be able to make it to a critical mass where then we can layer more solutions on top of it. And I think over the last few months, we have now started layering more solutions, which brings me to the core of the question. I think our objective is to have a seamless Africa, which can tap on financing solutions, which so many companies, including my very capable fellow colleague, has been able to create and bring all of that onto one platform. Our objective is then for someone in Ghana to purchase a product in Kenya, have that trust in the OmniBiz ecosystem, to not only finance that trade, but also fulfill that trade. And that can only happen when there is those gates in place, which is there is that regulation in place to be able to complete that end-to-end. I think that overall, the power that B2B e-commerce or e-commerce in general has is to boost this economic growth to all countries equally, to bring in to the growth story more economies which are towards the Central Africa, and kind of build from that to grow SMEs, which are the core engine of the continent.
Indeed. And when we think about SMEs, one of the key constraints tends to be financing. And so, Adesina, I'd love, to hear a little bit more from you about how Trade Lenda, really enables, not only SME growth, but this kind of idea of cross-border trade. And, what else would you like to see to enable financing, generally for businesses in Africa, but particularly for the SMEs that you serve? And feel free to kind of also explain Trade Lenda's core proposition for those who may not happen to know it.
Thank you very much. I strongly believe that everyone seated, for this panel is actually very, concerned about Africa or willing to hear more about Africa. And for those of you who don't know, about 84% of the jobs that we have in Africa are actually created by these MSMEs. And a whole lot of them are actually women. There's this saying that when you empower a woman, you're actually empowering a nation. And that is why I strongly believe that, for us to be able to get to where we want to be, we actually need to focus on these MSMEs. And the reason is not far-fetched. I grew up with a mom, just to put context, into why we do what we do. I grew up with a mom who, through her business, was able to train us to school, and then 30 years after, things haven't changed. So 30 years ago, we had, several goals. We had the Millennium Development Goals. Then now we have the Sustainable Development Goals. Now we have, the 2060 goals, for the Africa Free Trade. I think we need to cut down on just the talk and act, because we know what we can do. There have been various reports, like, for example, the Boston Consulting Group, saying that, e-commerce, fintech, can create the next 3 million new jobs by 2025. We're in 2023. It simply means that the 3 million new jobs are not visible. But can we create at least even the next 1 million jobs?
Yes. Oh, I love that.
The way we need to do, or what we need to do to be able to achieve this, is to support these MSMEs. Liquidity today is a huge problem, even for we that are actually operating, targeted towards supporting, these small businesses. But with initiatives like the Prosper Africa, the US government, and various development, agencies who are playing in this space, I'm happy to say that, through some of, the works of the US government, today we are able to support over 23,000 farmers in the northern part of Nigeria. These are initiatives that provide, some form of cover, and then helps us to be able to support more people in form of input and also off-taking, of their product. For the SMEs in the retail space, most manufacturers want to be able to give more to them, but we need to be able to provide policies, initiatives that encourage even the digital lenders to be able to do more, to be able to provide more financial access, not just in lending, but also in other financial services such as insurance, savings, and other assets. And that is what we need to drive as the true definition of financial inclusion. Inclusion shouldn't be for a specific sector. Inclusion should be for all businesses, all small businesses who want to be able to grow and have the potential to create between 1 to 10 jobs, from their enterprise, which when you look at, the population can translate to the next 1 million jobs that we can target, even if it's for 2025.
1 million jobs at 2025. I heard it from you.
Yeah.
But on that note, I think I was, we were talking earlier before coming up here, and I just need to call out, what percentage of your clients are women?
So today, our active users, today, over 85% of them are actually women.
85%. I think that is such a powerful statistic to show how fintech can be an engine for inclusion, but also how thoughtful entrepreneurs, highlighted by the two of you, can really be driving this. And again, northern Nigeria is not a place that is necessarily easy to be operating. That's really remarkable. All right, I'm getting the, your time is almost up, fingers from this side of the room. But I want to end us, really thinking about what this looks like over the next decade. Obviously, the four of you have been so involved in these questions at a ground level and over time. Whitney, kind of, what's the change that you've seen over the last decade when it comes to trade? But also, what do you think the next decade looks like? What excites you, and kind of paint us the picture of what this can be?
Well, I mean, what I've seen is what's right here. This wasn't here 10 years ago. This conference wasn't here 10 years ago. And I just think the explosion of technology, and I think that's really what we have to stay focused on. I mean, I resonate with this World Bank study that was done several years ago called the Digital Moonshot, that sort of targets bringing 1 billion people online. And I think we have to aim high. I know it's a goal, but some of these goals are really worth going for and mobilizing the capital to do it. So I think that's one part of it. But I think another part of it is sort of the non-digital trade. If AfCFTA is really going to realize it, what I see is strategic corridors like the highway from Abidjan to Lagos. How do you digitize sort of all the customs so people and goods and services can move more quickly? And then the physical trade and the digital trade will really reinforce one another. And I think we have to keep that perspective that we're not working in a vacuum as digital trade, but it has to be the whole ballgame working together.
Indeed, and with that, Zacharias, I'd love to turn to you to talk about, over the next 10 years where you see this, but also specifically, not only with the trade of goods and services and ideas, but kind of what else this means for African integration and growth.
Yes, so yes, the Continental Free Trade guarantees movement of goods from one location to another, but these goods are produced and consumed by people. So we need to have also a free movement of people. As organizer of the Africa FinTech Summit, we've seen that in the continent. Yeah. We have speakers here in the room who can get a US visa and come here, but who couldn't be in Cape Town or in Cairo just because they happen to have an African passport. So that needs to be addressed. The Africa Development Bank has raised it up. Right now, for conference organizers like ourselves, we are being almost forced to select a location that will have free access to Africans instead of focusing on the whole other matrix. So that should be, and I'm hopeful that it will be addressed. Mm-hmm. And secondly, also the Open Sky Agreement in Africa. So you have African airlines, small ones, bigger ones, couldn't even operate from one location in Africa to another because governments are protective, while other airlines, Europeans, Middle East, can fly anywhere in Africa. African airlines are protected. As a result, the inter-Africa airspace transaction has gone down from 40% to 20%, and that was 2 years ago and is going down, I'm sure. So we need to have an open air policy where transporters, including aircraft, should be able to travel. So governments need to change their policy. We should have a visa-free access, and if not, a visa-friendly access. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, movement of goods without movement of people would not be successful.
I'm going to have our two entrepreneurs kind of round us out, and would love to see kind of what your hopes are for your companies this next decade, but also what that means for the people you serve and the clients who utilize your services. And so, Adishina, maybe I'll start with you, and then Archie, will you close us out? Yep.
All right. For us, over the next decade, we want to be able to contribute towards, creating the next 1 million jobs, at least by 2027. Which is also aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. But to be able to achieve this, we hope that digital literacy gap will be closed out. The unbanked, especially those playing actively within the informal sector, can be absorbed into the more formal sector, help them to be able to have digital access to accounts and other financial services. I strongly believe that with the digital literacy gap being bridged, with education being pushed, to the front burner, and with access to other financial services, we will be able to achieve the Africa Free Trade goals. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you. So I think today we are focused on B2B e-commerce, and we are at $170 million in our GMV. But at the same time, we have 65,000 retailers who have a sizable portion of this being women, 80%. And I think where we see this going is there is $160 billion that's traded in sub-Saharan Africa. And all of this trade should be enabled through digital and financial inclusion. The three core aspects of this that we see are, number one, being seamless procurement, which needs trust, seamless financial inclusion, which also needs trust, and partners like TradeLenda. And number three is growth intelligence, where they have data and information as an overarching architecture to help promote what they should buy, what they should sell, and what price at. I think the core of this will have to be MSMEs. And I think this entire engine will be driven only if we're able to enable them. And we see ourselves being at the center of this and want to inspire more and more founders, want to inspire more and more companies to help build this ecosystem with us. Because at the end of the day, we're not doing any of this alone, and we think that all the partnerships that we have gotten us to this stage and will take us forward.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for the hard work that you do, for the energy you bring, for the trust that you help to build. And this is all a factor of the hard work that comes, for over years and through the hustle of folks like you and the people you work with and our partners on the ground in Africa. So thank you. Thank you all for listening today. And I'm looking forward to kind of keeping in touch with each of you and seeing these visions for the next decade come through and go beyond. Again, thank you. And if I may ask you for a round of applause for our fantastic panelists.